Hey everybody, welcome to the final part of lecture for this week. We are picking up where we left off last time, looking at was essentially the final stage of Rome's major persecution against Christians before Christianity sort of becomes a legalized religion. Now, we'll talk about later, but after Christianity becomes legalized, that doesn't mean that there are no longer any problems between Christians and the followers of the Roman religion. But we want to pick up now talking about the final stage of persecution that sort of began under the reign of Diocletian. And Diocletian ruled from 284 to 305 AD, which is right there at the end of the 3rd century, beginning of the 4th century. And one of the things that was unique about Diocletian was that he instituted a new system of rule. And this system of rule was based on the fact that there were 4 emperors rather than 1. And the thinking behind this is that if there are 4 emperors, there's less likely the chance for civil war, which, we talked about last week, affected Septimius Severus. We talked about that in the last lecture video, who had to deal with civil wars. Well, Diocletian thinks that if you've got 4 emperors, there's less likely to have unrest among and people wanting to try to reach the title of emperor if it's all being shared by 4 different individuals. Unfortunately, that doesn't work out for Diocletian, but that's the system that he put in place. There are 2 major emperors, one of which was Maximian in the west, and then Diocletian was in the east. And then the 2 minor emperors who were sort of the underlings of the major, you have Constantius Chlorus in the west and Galerius in the east. And I will pull up a map of this. Let me switch screens. And this map comes from, I believe, the University of South Florida. There you go, right there. So what you notice here is how this is laid out, right? So you've got, essentially this is, I believe, Constantius Chlorus's empire. His section's right here, the western part of the Roman Empire, the far west. I'm sorry, I had a text come in that I needed to read for a minute. So you've got in the far west, you've got Constantius Chlorus, who's the minor emperor, who's essentially there in the pink, which shows up actually better on your screen than it does on mine. But then in the yellow, you've got this would have been Maximian's territory because the city of Rome is within his vicinity. The green would be Galerius, who's the minor emperor, and depending on the map that you look at, there's some maps that have Galerius's territory actually going further down towards Greece, this part of Europe. And then you've got then Diocletian's territory is mainly here in the farther east, and I believe Constantinople is his capital. And Rome and Constantinople are going to become really the 2 main portions of the Roman Empire. In fact, we haven't talked about this because this isn't necessarily a history of, this isn't a history of the Roman Empire class per se, but you do have the empire split between west and east, with the western portion belonging to the capital being in Rome and the eastern portion, the capital, is in Constantinople. So that's sort of how the territory is laid out. What becomes important for us to note about this layout is that Galerius's territory is right here on the southern border of the Danube River. And the problem is that you've got a lot of the Germanic tribes, the stronger tribes, are situated in this portion of what we know today to be Central and Eastern Europe. And we'll talk about how that poses a problem in a minute, but when you're thinking about how the empire is divided out now, you've got 4 different emperors, and that's sort of a map that gives you an indication of how the territory was divided out. So I'm going to go back and pull up the PowerPoint. Here we go. And in all, you've got relative peace at first. Seems like everything's fine. In fact, with Diocletian, his wife and his daughter are both Christians, openly Christians. So it seems like everything's going to go fine for Christianity, but that is not going to be the case at all moving forward. And that's where we turn to now. So persecution sort of begins under Diocletian's reign. It begins within the last few years of the 3rd century, so around 295 to 300 AD. And it all began because, for whatever reason, there were a group of Christian soldiers that were struggling to obey their orders to comply with the military. And again, this is happening in Galerius's territory, which we talked about was there on the southern border of the Danube River, right across from some of the most powerful Germanic tribes who later on are going to be the ones that invade and conquer Rome. And for whatever reason, again, there are Christians that are struggling to comply with these orders. And so what Galerius essentially tells Diocletian to do is that he wants Christians to be banned from military. And so, fighting an enemy, Galerius is worried about Christians not obeying his orders and, weakening Rome's defenses, so he doesn't want Christians in the military. And the way that writers sort of portray this series of events that we're talking about is that sort of Diocletian's not necessarily a harsh individual, or he's not so much an antagonist of Christianity as much as it is Galerius who's the main antagonist of Christianity. And it sort of you're given the indication that Galerius is a lot of times whispering in Diocletian's ears to get him to do what Galerius wants, especially as it pertains to Christians. Well, he not only gets them banned from military, but he also gets them banned from public offices because you run the risk of Christians being disloyal to the Roman Empire. And I'll put this on the screen in a moment, but really you've got, again, like you had with Marcus Aurelius, like you had with Septimius Severus and with Decius, what you've got going on here is a series of outbreaks and problems within the empire. And this is further causing people to speculate that Christians are the ones that are responsible for all these things. And that's sort of the same progression is going on here, and that's why things are progressively getting worse for Christians in terms of, at first just being banned from the military, but now being banned from government offices. And then eventually things get so bad that mandates are carried out where Christians, their buildings, their homes, and maybe at this point some early official designated places of worship are being torn down, and they are told to burn their books. A lot of times this is being done in public fashion, and again they are being told that they have to sacrifice to the Roman gods. All of this happening largely in response to trying to find someone who is really responsible for some of the problems that the Roman Empire is struggling with at the time. And in all of this, while this is going on, Galerius is sort of maneuvering his way to become the supreme emperor in the old fashion where you only had one emperor, especially after Diocletian will die. And after Diocletian dies, he's going to force Maximian, the other major emperor in the West, to abdicate. And Diocletian essentially puts his men in, Galerius essentially puts his men in charge. And so what we might think of as the minor emperors that Diocletian had created, that office, Galerius had essentially hired his underlings, or people that were going to be sympathetic to his positions, to basically be, really to serve him rather than to serve the Roman Empire in a general sense. And it's interesting to note that within Diocletian and Galerius's court, his advisors was a man named Constantine, who was the son of Constantius Chlorus, who becomes important, as we'll talk about next week, when it comes to the legalization of Christianity. And we'll sort of return to this next week because Constantine's story is sort of wrapped up in all of this as well, and we'll save a portion of that for next week. But now we want to move on to the final part, and again, we're not going to be very long in this, but the rationale and the rumors that were given and that were reported as sort of the reason why Christians are increasingly being targeted with persecution. So there are a few things that we want to talk about within rationale. One of the reasons why Christians were sort of targeted is because that within the growth of Christianity, there's a growing potential for, at least some Roman writers were thinking that there could be a massive revolution based on the growth of Christianity. And we'll explain that more in a minute. And there are also some that pointed out, can we really trust Christians to serve in the military? And this will go back to some of the thoughts that Galerius had. But not only that, you also had to deal with the fact that Christians essentially appeared to be defectors from the empire. And we'll explain that a little bit more in a moment. Now, within the rumors, there are essentially a few that we'll note. So you had some rumors that were that sort of dealt with Christians and how they were easily manipulated and how they could prey on the uneducated and easily manipulate them. And we sort of hinted at that already, but we'll talk about it maybe a little bit more in depth in a minute. At the same time, you've got rumors that are going about what Christians are doing in their worship services. And in connection with that, there are also rumors being spread about what Christians are doing within the Lord's Supper. And apparently, I forgot to put the animations in there. So all of it pops up at one time. So maybe that'll help you get that copy down a little bit. So Christianity. When you're thinking about sort of the rationale, right? So we start off by talking about this idea of Christianity being a massive revolution. We're not talking about this in a military sense. When you have the idea of revolution, typically we think about the overthrow of a government, a war that's fought, a civil war, things of that nature. But the type of revolution that some Romans were afraid of Christians starting was not a violent military revolution, more so what we might could say is sort of a revolution in culture, a revolution within society, because Christianity was essentially an anti-Roman society, an anti-Roman system. And we talked about that before, about the differences between the religion and the practices of Christianity and the Roman Empire. But you think about, Christians are presenting a new system of morality that more and more Roman citizens are buying into, which is different from what the traditions of Rome expected. You've got a new hierarchy that's being established within the church structure, right? You've got, at this point you've got bishops over maybe areas, and you got elders underneath them, and so you've got sort of what we might say is a system of government that is beginning to rival the Roman Empire in terms of people's loyalty. The religious expectations are changing, right? Religion in the Roman Empire, according to the traditions, it's a very public thing. It's a part of civic life, whereas now Christians have sort of privatized religion in the sense of the worship setting being more confined and things of that nature. And as we pointed out there at the very beginning of this week, Christianity is spreading into various places within the empire. And it's not just being spread in rural places where there's less of a population. The hot spots of Christianity are in some of the most populous areas of the empire within these cities. And so this growth begins to rival and pose a threat to the Roman religion. One thing that I'll note about cities, and maybe we could think about this in connection to what we talked about last week, if you were to put yourself in a time machine and go back to these first 4 centuries, and you were wanting to find out where, Christianity was the strongest, you wouldn't go to the rural areas. You wouldn't go to the countryside to find the strongest collection of Christians. You would actually go into the cities where most people lived. In fact, the word pagan, right? We use pagan to talk about Pagan, pagan, to talk about the religion of the Romans, right? And how they were polytheistic and things like that. The word pagan actually meant and was used to denote somebody who lived in the countryside, or somebody who was a rural person rather than an urban citizen. And part of the connection between paganism and Roman religion was that Christians were increasingly being found in cities, and that the weakest area for Christianity was often in the countryside. And that's, I think, in a way very different from where we are at in the United States today, because we think about the strongest presence of Christianity, we think about the Bible Belt, right? And the Bible Belt, of course, is generally not the most populous area, right? You don't associate New York City as being a hotbed of Christianity, or Los Angeles or Seattle or Chicago, places like that. Even though there are Christians there, you don't think about it being a hot spot for Christianity. And even within the South, right, we don't think about Atlanta being a hot spot for Christianity. We typically think about in the countryside, the rural areas, smaller towns where the strongest presence of Christianity is. And, looking at and comparing that, maybe that's, a question, why does Christianity not seem to grow as much today as it did back then? Well, you had more Christians that are in urban areas where there are more people to interact with. Whereas today, most Christians live in the countryside and in smaller towns where there is not as many people, there are not as many potential converts to reach. So maybe that's something that's interesting to think about. But in all of this, with this potential of a massive revolution, you've got a powerful counterculture that's developing within the empire. A counterculture that is, in a lot of ways, inherently opposed to the dominant culture of the Roman elite. And if we think about that within our own country, some of you may remember, some of you may have studied in American history, the 1960s, 1970s, because one of the key things that's often taught and often noted about that time frame is the growth of a counterculture that was often strongly critical of the United States and some of its actions. And there were a lot of people that didn't like the counterculture because they thought it was a threat to the United States. And so, in a sense, Christianity in the Roman Empire sort of acted in a way like that counterculture, because they did criticize the empire and some of the things that it did. So maybe that gives you an idea of where Christianity sort of fit within the empire and why people saw it as a problem, especially the elites and the government officials saw it as a problem, and why Christians needed to be persecuted. You also have a question about military service, and there was no official position that the church laid down in the sense that Christians stated that that one could not serve in the military, right? It was sort of a judgment matter. You could serve in the military if you wanted to. There were others that were actually strong, what we would call to be pacifists, that didn't believe in serving in the military back then. So there's no official policy about the Christian's role within religion. It was sort of left up to each individual. And there were some individuals that held a pretty strong view against serving in the military. So in practice, what happened is, with Galerius in 295 AD, there were a number of Christians that either refused to join the military or that were trying to get out. And that's how they were disobeying orders. Now, we don't know exactly the reasons why that happened, but it led to the ban of Christianity. One reason why they may not have been complicit with the orders being given by the generals was that, if you think about it, Christians were often the targets of persecution, and so you would have a Christian that serves as a Roman soldier going and persecuting his own brother or sister in Christ. And, obviously, we would, I think most Christians would never do that. They would stop at that point. But keep in mind that apparently that's at least one reason why a lot of Christians had problems serving in the military back then, because there was the potential that if persecution arose, that you would be called upon to afflict and possibly kill your fellow Christian, which a lot of Christians didn't want to do. Within Galerius's position or his statement that Diocletian, passes that bans Christians from military service, apparently within Galerius's own army, there were some generals that were afraid of having their ranks thinned to the point that they wouldn't be able to fight against those Germanic tribes that are across the Danube River there in Central and Eastern Europe that pose a threat of invasion. And so some of these generals sort of persecuted their own soldiers to get them to reject Christ and to recant their faith and to give up on it. And so apparently a lot of Christian soldiers, or at least some Christian soldiers, actually died. They not only were banned, but some even died because of some of these zealous generals that did not want to lose soldiers. So this question about not obeying military commands, this is obviously a red flag to Roman officials. That's part of the rationale why they would have persecuted Christians. And then the third thing that I want to point out is the possibility of defection. And that's just the idea of Christians leaving the empire. You keep in mind in all of this, again, the spread of Christianity. Christianity is not just going throughout the Roman Empire, it's going throughout all of the world. And we've talked about in the first video about how it's spreading outside of the empire, and it's spreading into territories where the people are natural enemies to the Romans. Those in Parthia, right, in Iraq, modern day Iraq, Iran, and that area, right to the east. And then to the northeast, those Germanic tribes, you've got Christians going and proselytizing there. And so some emperors and some officials saw this as Christians defecting from the Roman Empire. At the same time, you've got some Christians that are leaving probably to avoid persecution. And even though, especially in Parthia, there were moments where Christians were being persecuted, there are also times where it would have been a lot better to live in Parthia or to live in the Germanic tribes, maybe because there's not such a systematic persecution of Christians like what's going on under the reign of Diocletian. And so with these Christians that are leaving the empire, that sort of gives a red flag to Roman officials that maybe Christians aren't very loyal to us. And if you think about it in a modern sense, a modern day example of this, you think about what happens in North Korea when you've got a North Korean that defects to South Korea or escapes to China. And generally, what reports say happen is that when the defector leaves the country, that the military or the government officials in North Korea, they go and they find the family of the defector and they torture, punish them, put them in a labor camp. And they do that because they don't want people to leave. Well, maybe you think about it in the same sense here. Whereas, Rome look suspiciously on these defectors, and so in order to prevent that, you persecute Christians. If you're a Christian and you leave, maybe your family's affected by that. But that's sort of a modern day example, and these three things are problems for the Roman Empire. You not only have these, what we might point out as ideas of these ideas of rationale that the Roman Empire had, we also keep in mind that there are a lot of rumors. One we'll talk about to begin with, this idea that Christians are easily manipulated. And this sort of traces back towards the founding of Christianity, because a lot of Romans, and especially the Roman writer Celsus, argued that Christ was essentially a liar. Celsus is the one that states that Christ was actually born of an illegitimate relationship between Mary and a Roman soldier, rather than being born as what Matthew and Luke describe, the gospel accounts describe. And if you remember in your Bibles, John chapter 8, Jesus is talking with the Pharisees, and in the process of him talking to them, the Pharisees the leaders that he's talking to, they bring up the fact that something that sort of seems out of the box or sort of off the discussion. These leaders bring up this point that they were not born of fornication. Again, this is coming from John chapter 8. And it might have been that this idea about Jesus, at least being born from Mary having an adulterous relationship with another man, that this rumor traces all the way back even to the time of Jesus. Don't know that for sure, but we do know that Celsus thought that Christ was really the son of an adulterous relationship, rather than being being born of God, being the Son of God. Celsus also stated that Christ was essentially a magician and a trickster. The things that he did, the miracles that he performed, were not actually real, but because that Christians were uneducated and the people that he taught to were poor and uneducated, they believed that what Christ was doing was actually the power of God, and that's why they followed him. He also pointed out that Christ was essentially a common criminal that died under Roman law. And this was all rumors that were being spread about Christ, and that necessarily reflected pretty poorly on his followers. There were also some Christians that claimed to still be performing miracles in the 3rd and 4th century. And there are accounts where supposedly there are some Christian teachers that are going out into the wilderness and taking people with them, and they go into these secluded areas and they perform all of these wonderful miracles, and the people believe them. And then they come back to the city and they keep spreading that message about this man performing miracles. And the point being is that doing all these things in secret, that sort of brought skepticism on some of the Roman writers. And again, that just reinforced the idea that Christians are easily manipulated. Like, these teachers can't do it in open in front of Roman skeptics. They're having to take the people away into secluded areas where no one's going to criticize them. So that's part of the idea of the rumors about Christians being easily manipulated. And sometimes this took the form of pictures, making fun of Christians and making fun of Christ. And I will pull up a picture real quick of one apparently common Roman depiction of Christ, hanging on the cross but having the head of a donkey. And this is called, you might be able to see it on the screen, Alexamenos and the Alexamenos graffiti inscription. And so, looking on the screen to see how well you can see that, this is from the University of Chicago. But you can basically be able to see the outline. I may be able to zoom in a little bit for you. But you see, right, you've got a man hanging on the cross there, and then you've got the head of a donkey that's attached to it. And this was a common way in which people would make fun of and mock Christians, that Christians essentially worshipped a donkey. And a donkey is not necessarily the most intelligent of animals, and so again, making fun of the intelligence of Christians. And I will say that it wasn't uncommon for Romans to spread rumors, not just about Christians, but about other people as well. If I'm not mistaken, I didn't write this down, but we talked about Tacitus before, and I believe it was Tacitus that talked about some people outside the Roman Empire, some of those Germanic tribes, how they had like eyes in their bellies, or instead of the head being on top, the head was in the belly, or something like that. So this idea of spreading rumors among Roman philosophers and elites and academics and things like that was not uncommon, but it was targeted at Christians, and that's important for us to note. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. and continue on. All right, so let's talk about the worship setting. So you always want to keep in mind that essentially Christian worship was done in secret to the Romans, right? They're worshiping in private homes. It's not a public thing like the Roman religion. We talked about how that for some of the worship services, you've got non-members that there's an occasion where non-members are told to leave the audience so that the Christians can partake of the Lord's Supper. And so this idea of secrecy caused Roman writers to be pretty skeptical of Christians. This helped promote rumors about them. And I am not going to talk about all the details of this. There is more that we can talk about that won't be discussed here. But that's mainly because we want to keep this PG, because some of the accounts about what Romans were saying that Christians were doing in their worship are extremely graphic, and so we're just sort of going to give the PG version of it here. So one thing about their worship was that essentially these were opportunities for Christians to commit fornication. And the way that some Roman writers portrayed this is that when Christians came to worship, they would come and eat a great meal, they would drink a lot of wine and get drunk, and then after all that happened, they would turn the lights out, and essentially people would commit fornication. And it would sort of be a pretty common affair. There were also charges there were also statements. Anyway, we'll move on from that. There are also charges that Christians committed were involved in incestuous relationships, and this really came from the idea of how Christians called their fellow members brothers and sisters in Christ, and it was just simply a misconception about that relationship. But there were Christians that were charged with with living in those type of relationships because of the nature of Christians and being brothers and sisters in Christ. And those were very prominent rumors. And then with the Lord's Supper, some very serious rumors went about what went on, because this was a lot of times being done in secret. There were some that said that Christians were actually practicing cannibalism when they partook of the Lord's Supper. And this is probably because of the misunderstanding that the body and blood of Christ was, when in reality it was simply figurative. It was a representation of it. Some Roman writers took it to be that it was literal, that they were literally consuming the body and blood. And so cannibalism was a charge that was leveled against Christians. You also have within the Lord's Supper rumors about ritualistic murder. And there are accounts of this. One this is a little bit graphic, but not too risque. There's an account of Christians finding a young man and taking him and going in to partake of the Lord's Supper, and they kill the young man. They take his heart out, and they essentially cook his heart. And the Lord's Supper meal essentially was them eating his heart and then drinking his blood. And that was the partaking of the body and blood of Christ. And in the process of that, all the members that participated in it swore an oath to secrecy, that they would tell no man what happened here. That was what one Roman writer said about the Lord's Supper, that it was ritualistic murder. Some even went so far to suggest that not only do you have ritualistic murder, but that Christians in the Lord's Supper were committing infanticide, or the killing of infants. Again, sort of the same process as before. The child would be brought in, would be killed. They would eat the infant's body and blood, and you have that same process. Now, it was known that Christians did take abandoned infants, partly because that in the Roman Empire the laws were not very strict about abandoning infants. And that really pertained to any type of deformity. So any type of physical deformity, any type of abnormality in the birth, like a child being born that's extremely big or extremely small, maybe like a premature birth or things like that. Any type of deformity, maybe some type of physical deformity. Maybe you're missing some fingers or missing some toes. Maybe things like Down syndrome or things like that. Things that people noted that were different about a normal infant. Sometimes the Roman people would abandon those infants, those with physical deformities. And sometimes they would just abandon infants just in general. And one of the things about Christians that was noted by Tertullian was that Christians oftentimes did take these infants that were abandoned. And I don't have a picture here, but if you go back and look on the PowerPoint from last week when we talked about the catacombs, if you look at the slits that are cut out into the rocks, you notice that some slits are actually smaller than others. And it's supposed that some of those slits were given for infants that had died that Christians went and essentially adopted, but maybe they didn't make it very long into life, and so they were killed and they were actually buried sometimes within the catacombs. But Tertullian's pretty clear about this, that Christians did have a tendency to take infants, not to kill them and perform ritualistic murder and infanticide with connecting with the Lord's Supper, but they took these infants and essentially raised them out of compassion, right? Tertullian stated that Christians often found infants that were just sort of thrown in the garbage heap, the dung hills where people's refuse would go. They would find infants in both of those places where people threw their garbage and refuse out, and they essentially, when they took them, they essentially adopted them, treated them like their own. In fact, within some of the catacombs, you can see within I don't have a picture of it here, but apparently you can see within some of those smaller graves where it says the word adopted there. And that's probably to denote that the infant that died was a child that had been abandoned, that a Christian took in and decided to raise as their own. So they called them adopted, right? And the last thing that I'll say about this, again, most of these rumors are just rumors. They're not true at all. I will mention that, we talked about the Gnostic libertines, right? The people that essentially said because all flesh is evil, that gives us the liberty to sin all the sin as much as we want because we can't escape the physical body. We talked about that a few weeks ago, the Gnostic libertines. It could have been that some of these rumors came about because of the practice of these libertines, especially the idea of worship being a place for fornication. It's very possible that this was going on amongst the libertines, who are a radical minor sect of, quote unquote Christianity, and they don't really represent the mainstream or the majority of Christians in the empire. That could have been a reason why these rumors were being connected around, but these rumors are really unfounded. Most historians would point out. I actually had a teacher that taught my 1/4 of my Greek class at Mississippi State. I had him for a semester. I also had him for a class called Christianity in the Roman Empire, which actually now is very helpful for teaching this class. But he talked about these rumors, and he made a point that I thought that was really well thought out, that sort of explains all of this, these rumors that were being spread. And he just simply stated that these rumors were not so much a reflection of what Christians were doing as much as it was a reflection of the type of people that the Romans were. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, that sometimes these rumors are being spread to sort of take attention away from the real immorality that existed, in the Roman Empire. Because things like infanticide, ritualistic murder, when you're abandoning infants, obviously That's a form of infanticide. You think about the type of fornication and relationships that were being reported by Christians. There were Roman emperors that had been guilty of doing these very same things. So these rumors, in a large part, were probably more a reflection of who the Romans were. At least some of these Romans were a reflection of them rather than being a reflection of Christians. Nevertheless, these rumors were important because it drew criticism, it drew skepticism toward Christianity, and helped push Roman officials, to begin to persecute them. And so that's where we will wrap up for this week. Next week we will talk about the legalization of Christianity that will come just a few years after Galerius has sort of in part leveled one of the strongest forms of persecution that Christians that Christians up to this point had seen. But we'll stop here. Thank you for your time and your attention. If you got any questions, feel free to email me, and I hope you all have a good week.